It's Friday somewhere, and we are working for Crusoe. We are taping the evening of Thursday, April 18th on the West Coast. Sam Park and John Ramey, both in Los Angeles. But
it's Friday in Iran.
Yeah, we're reacting to events taking place in the Middle East where it is already Friday, April 19th. Israel has attacked Iran, with U.S. officials confirming a missile strike. Iranian news agencies saying it's a drone strike. This is in response to the over 300 drones and missiles Iran fired almost totally unsuccessfully at Israel this past Saturday. These two strikes represent the first time Iran and Israel have directly attacked the other's soil. This is an apparent escalation in something like a 40-year shadow war. Sam Park, the initial reports confirmed by multiple outlets and confirmed by officials within the U.S. government was that the Israelis notified the Americans that they were going to attack Iran with a missile. Iranian news agencies have reported explosions on a military base in the city of Isfahan, which is approximately 250 miles south of the capital, Tehran. We do not know if the Israelis were targeting some nuclear facilities which were there, if they were targeting the military air base which was there. We don't know a lot of things, but we also don't know if there are additional targets, additional attack sites. Your first thoughts on this wild development?
Well, I was just now watching the BBC from Washington, and they had on a couple of people who are from the former George W. Bush administration. One of them was a retired general named Mark Kimmett, who served in the State Department under George W. Bush. And another one was a fellow named Michael Singh, who was on the National Security Council at the same time. So these two guys knew each other, but both had some expertise in the region. General Kimmett seemed to think that the target might be the nuclear facility. But one thing that he took pains to point out was that neither Israel nor Iran has publicly said that Israel did this. And General Kimmett seemed to think that this might be a reversion to form. In other words, Iran was not at all shy about saying that they had conducted the attack last Saturday, right? But if you don't immediately step up and say so, or don't ever step up and say so, this gives you, I would say, an implausible deniability. But at least you're not going out in public and saying, we kicked Iran in the butt, right?
And this is in the tradition of kind of the shadow war that's been going on. For example, the attack on the Iranian embassy in Damascus, carried out by Israel earlier this month, that seemed to start this recent cascade of events. Yeah. I don't believe Israel ever said they did that.
I don't believe they did either. And so, yes, it will be a reversion to form.
Which is a relative good.
Yes, but by the time anybody hears this broadcast, this could all be moot. There could be additional attacks, and Israel could have stepped up and said, we did this, right? So this is all highly speculative at this point. And I think if we should make sure that we point that out. But if it's a reversion to form, I guess we can count that as a good thing. But then we're sort of in this whole national security professionals area, right? Which both of these gentlemen are, both Kimmett and Singh. They do this kind of thing for a living. I myself I just don't want there to be any sort of escalation, right? I want there to be peace. And the problem, I think, and General Kimmett pointed this out, is that miscalculations happen all the time. And there seems to have been no shortage of them, at least in last Saturday's attack, I'd say, which at the time, my first reaction was, this is very serious and, very concerning. But my second and almost immediate reaction after the first one was, this is weird and kind of stupid. And up until today, nothing has disabused me of that notion, because General Kimmett was at least the third expert commentator I've heard say that after last Saturday, Iran would have difficulty mounting that same level of attack again for some length of time before they could reconstitute their forces to the point where they could mount it again. At the same time, they gave the United States 3 days notice of how the attack was going to take place, to the point where even those Iranian munitions that did not fail by themselves, which quite a few of them did, could be shot down by a half a dozen different countries: the United States, Israel, Great Britain, France, apparently Saudi Arabia, and
Even Jordan was mentioned.
Well, no, that shouldn't surprise anybody. Jordan's right on the flight path, and they have a peace treaty with Israel, and they're the major U.S. ally. It was the Saudi involvement that I found a little curious, frankly. And I'm thinking to myself, if you're using that many munitions to the point where you'd have trouble doing the same thing again tomorrow, but you're telling the allies of your adversary what your plan is.
Yeah, it's counterintuitive.
And so it seems, I think we would do well to remember that, we sort of think of Iran and Israel as individual entities, but they're not. For instance, we know from widespread reporting that decisions being made inside the Israeli war cabinet are often contentious and disputatious, right? There's a lot of disagreement amongst the members of that cabinet about how to proceed with things on a virtually daily basis.
To say nothing of what the Americans might chime in with.
Exactly. And by the way, David Cameron and Annalena Baerbock, the foreign ministers of the United Kingdom and Germany, were in Israel yesterday, kvetching at them, saying, please show restraint. And so, which they've got to do. That's their job. But we don't have anywhere near as much visibility into the Iranian military, which is a very large organization. And in any large organization, as we've discussed many times in many different contexts, there will be factions and disagreements, but we don't know what their disagreements are like. But we can almost imagine hardliners going, let's give them everything we got, right? And other people going, no, that's stupid, right? And if you're going to give them everything we got, then we're going to have to tell people, right? And someone who gets to make the final decision going, okay, let's do both of those things. If it'll make you happy, we'll give them everything we got. If it'll make you happy, then we'll tell the Americans, right? And so nobody's fully happy, but they can come up with a consensus decision. No, I have no idea if any of this ever happened, but it would seem to fit with the facts available to us, which are, of course, not all the facts, but they're the only ones we know. I'm just saying that there's these weird, almost quantum scenarios that can take place where it's both this and that. And I think there's been a lot of that in this week of exchanges between Iran and Israel on both sides.
U.S. President Joe Biden and others, as you mentioned, have encouraged restraint from Israel following the Iranian attack this past Saturday. Again, over 300 drones and missiles, 99% of which failed to reach their targets in Israel. The Iron Dome performing miraculously well.
With help from their friends.
Right. But also, the first time Iran had directly struck Israeli soil. And Joe Biden had said to Bibi Netanyahu, take the win. Just take the win. It didn't work. Take the win. Was that ever a reasonable expectation to think Israel could do that? Because in that neighborhood, you've got to punch back, right?
I don't think it was reasonable, but he did have to say it.
Of course.
And he was not the only person saying it.
But there's no world in which even a non-Netanyahu government in Israel they don't have some, even if it's just tit for tat, response to that. That can't not happen.
I agree with that entirely. But there's always the danger of miscalculation, and that's my biggest fear here. For example, it was very easy in the wake of last Saturday's attack for anybody to sort of come at it from how they generally think about these things on any given day, given their ideological predispositions. There were plenty of people, and some of them Israeli, by the way, who were saying that Netanyahu wants to escalate the war, so they attacked the embassy compound, the Iranian embassy compound in Damascus, knowing that Iran would have to respond, and therefore he could drag everybody into World War III, or at least a broader regional war, and the United States would have to come back to Israel's side after being seen to sort of be drifting away from Israel.
Right. And I read that narrative too. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think we all
encountered it.
And I have to admit, some part of me kind of wanted to believe something like that, but it doesn't actually fully make sense, right? For example, again, the war cabinet is not a unified body, right? He can't make that decision by himself. Many Israeli commentators say that he's not even actually in charge of the war cabinet. I don't know if that's true, but neither does anybody else. That's the point I'm making, right? Is that this narrative is just too easy.
It's too tidy.
It's too easy for us to fall into. The other thing about it that I would say, though, and this is the part I find most interesting, is that, as we know, the Israeli public has generally been very supportive of the conduct of the war in Gaza thus far, since October 7th. There hasn't been enough time for there to be extensive polling in Israel since last Saturday's attack, but there has been some. And I would say also that Israel is a very small country, so it might be a little bit easier to take an accurate poll there than it is in our country. But so far, the polling data we see would seem to indicate that escalating this conflict into a broader war with Iran is not something the broader Israeli public would support, which might seem surprising at first, but when I took a second thought at it, it made more sense to me. For instance, having a conflict with the Palestinians is something that has always happened throughout the entire history of the nation of Israel. It's part of their culture to do this.
It's a founding characteristic.
Exactly, right? Whereas having what would be almost entirely an air war with Iran, that's a totally different order of magnitude. Israel hasn't had to do something like that since the Yom Kippur War of 50 years ago. And you could see how that might give people pause. It's one thing to support flattening Gaza, right? But going to war against Iran, I think a lot of people would have second thoughts about that. And so I found that fascinating. Now, again, this may not be an entirely accurate poll, but it's something to keep in mind. And I think someone like Netanyahu who is, for all that I detest him, a skilled politician. This is not something that he can afford to ignore. He's only hanging on to power because he's fighting a war in a fashion that the Israeli public broadly
approves
supports.
Yeah.
And if they're going to turn against his conduct of the war, it could be very, very bad for him.
I'm going to throw the map up here just so we look at the geography of the circumstances. But Israel, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, right? These are kind of one alliance regionally with the United States, France, European countries.
Yeah, Saudi Arabia is sort of the odd man out there. They don't officially have an alliance.
Sure, but
with
they were
Israel.
prior to October 7th, the Saudis and the Israelis were in the process of brokering as some kind of alliance, like some sort of groundbreaking alliance, frankly.
A treaty, at any rate. Yeah. I wouldn't go so far as to call it an alliance.
Sure, a treaty. With Iran, you have the Hezbollah proxies in Lebanon, which is on the immediate northern border of Israel. So,
yes, and just before we came on tonight, there were reports of explosions on that border. Now, that happens pretty much every day, so that might not necessarily mean anything.
But they have hundreds of thousands of missiles and artillery to lob into Israel. So if this Israeli strike, again, this is speculation, if this Israeli strike does lead to an escalation, which, again, it may not, right? This may be a restrained tit for tat as opposed to an escalation, given the scope of the Iranian attack from this past weekend. But if this is an escalation, then you have that front opening up. So you're looking at air war over Jordan and Iraq to Iran, right? Iran has to go over Iraq and Jordan. Israel has to go over Jordan and Iraq to attack Iran. And then you're also looking at a war to the north of Israel against Lebanon and potential likely deaths of the Lebanese just for being next to wherever Hezbollah is, in addition to the war in the south and Gaza. So that's a northern front, a southern front, and then an air war to the east for the Israelis.
Yeah, so you could see why the Israeli public might
think that's not ideal.
Exactly. And by the way, the last time that Israel mounted any serious military operation outside their own borders was their occupation of Lebanon from the 80s on to the beginning of this century, which went very badly for them, by the way. Before they went into Lebanon, there was no such thing as Hezbollah. And Hezbollah actually formed in response to the Israeli invasion of southern Lebanon. Believe me, everybody in Israel knows this. They had to retreat under fire from southern Lebanon back around the year 2000. This did not go well for them at all. Meanwhile, on the other side, not only was last Saturday the first time that Iran had directly attacked Israel, it's actually the first time the Islamic Republic of Iran had ever directly attacked anybody. It was their
directly attacked.
Yes. For instance, their last very serious military entanglement was their war with Iraq, essentially
in the 80s.
But Iraq started that war.
Right.
Full on, right? There's no question about that. And this was a catastrophically traumatic experience for Iran. It was easily the deadliest war of the 20th century after World War II. That is, chronologically after World War II. It was awful. And that, I think many people believe, is one reason why Iran has generally chosen to project power by means of proxy forces ever since then. As soon as that war was over, they were able to help Hezbollah stand up in Lebanon and begin, establishing other proxy forces such as the Houthis more recently, and of course Hamas.
There's a political question, and then there's a diplomatic question, and we'll start with the diplomatic question with regard to the United States. If there's an escalating conflict between Iran and Israel, does the United States simply their regard for Gaza gets deprioritized, right? Because the United States will defend Israel against Iranian aggression, right?
I believe so, yes.
That's a political reality in this country.
I'm not certain about that. I wouldn't bet money on it, or at least not a lot of money. I might bet $1 that you're right.
Okay, how about this? Regardless of whether it's a political reality in this country, shouldn't the United States back the only liberal democracy in the region if it's being attacked by a belligerent theocracy?
Oh, that's certainly the argument in favor of doing so. At the same time, there's...
Again, if this is escalating.
Yes. There's a strategic question involved here.
Right.
That will have to be addressed. I think, honestly, considering that the idea that Joe Biden is the president, I believe you're probably right about that. That is the decision that at the end of the day, I think Joe Biden would make. But there's other things involved here, right? I mean, you don't have to be a hard leftist or any sort of anti-Semite or anything like this to understand that Israel's conduct of the war in Gaza has been unacceptable and
has diminished their standing in the world, has diminished
yes,
their standing with their allies.
And I would say that it has not served their own interests, by the way. But that again, I'm not Israeli. It's not my place to say that. But they're not doing themselves any favors. And there's been so many reports of just mistakes that they've made on the operational level. And of course, these things are not easy to do. I don't mean to, like I would do a better job or something like that. Obviously, I wouldn't, right? But you need to be, if you're going to do these things, you need to be very careful. And the overall point I would make is that both sides, that is Israel and now Iran, which is basically what I've been getting at all tonight, they've both got every good reason to de-escalate this conflict, right? Again, Iran hasn't fought a full-on shooting war with anybody in 35 years.
And the last one was heinous.
That's right. And they have no institutional culture of being able to do this, which I think might explain to some extent why last Saturday's attack seemed so sort of inept, right? In the ways we've already outlined here. And again, Israel hasn't had a direct, sustained international confrontation with another country in almost 25 years. And that one went very badly. So at some point, there should be some way for Joe Biden or somebody else, right, to be able to get the messages through to both sides and say, look, you guys are not good at this, so don't do it. All right? The military resources that performed seemingly by far the best in this whole exchange are American, right? Sure, the Iron Dome worked okay, right? But they needed help from 5 or 6 other countries. And unfortunately, the United States does have more recent experience of fighting international wars. So we have some credibility in this arena. Take it from us, fellas. This is hard. And if you screw it up, it's going to be bad for everybody. Stop doing this. Honestly, I think that's the position I would prefer the United States to take.
What about China, Russia, their relationships with Iran, right? 20% of the world's petroleum is going through the Strait of Hormuz.
Yes.
Right. So that's right by Iran. If Iran is a military target, that's not good for anybody's gas prices.
No.
Anybody's economy on planet Earth. So we've got the West and then we've got the rest, right? So does China have a role to play in telling Iran to simmer?
Oh, I think they do, yes. And I'm not certain they haven't already done so in other contexts. You'll recall, I think it was in February, when in response to some attack by somebody, Iran seemed to explode in an orgy of missile firing in all directions, including at Pakistan, right? And that seemed to calm down very quickly. And I'm speculated at the time that this is a job for China because China has great relations with both Iran and Pakistan, who normally had very good relations with one another. And just to say to Iran, it's like, look, you can fire all you want to your west. As soon as you start firing east, we got a problem. All right. And I think if this does escalate any further, or it begins to look like it's going to, hopefully China can be prevailed upon to try and do something about it. And I don't think that's unlikely at all. They'll do it very quietly, by the way. as they normally do.
I was talking about kind of the political and the diplomatic question with regard to the United States earlier. The other thing is, if this does escalate, is Gaza just small potatoes now, kind of in the equation of support for Israel internationally?
I hope not. It's possible it'll work out that way. I'd sort of doubt it, though. For example, if this does escalate, what's going to happen to the Israeli military effort in Gaza?
Right.
Or, I mean, the tanks.
They might have to make some hard choices if they're fighting a three-front war.
Yeah, missiles don't grow on trees. And again, if Iran's ordnance is as depleted as numerous commentators have said it is, what are they really going to do, right? By the way, Vladimir Putin's probably sitting there going, hey, I needed those drones, right? Because Iran's been supplying many, many drones to Russia in their fight against Ukraine. Now, drones are relatively easy to manufacture, and I'm sure
they're cheap. Much cheaper than missiles.
Exactly. And I'm sure that there are drone factories in Iran that are working round the clock right now. But still, it takes some time to make them. And so there's issues of resources that you and I, John, don't have any visibility inside of.
Why doesn't Iran just wait to get the bomb?
Well,
they're at 60% enrichment now. You need 90% for weapons grade, right?
I think that...
Do they just not see a timeline that clearly?
I think they might fear that the closer they get, the more of a target they'll become. Because, people say all the time, look, we don't want that to happen. And for,
I'm in that camp, by the way.
Yeah,
I don't want them to have nuclear weapons.
I don't want anybody to have them, right? And, it's bad enough that so many people have them already. I just don't want that number to grow any larger. But
so you think they're sufficiently incentivized to maybe not go all the way up to weapons grade enrichment just because it would make them more of a target? That's interesting. I mean, they are relatively rational actors.
They are, but again, it's a very large state, right? That is their state system is very large and has many different players inside of it. By the way, the Supreme Leader, Ali Khamenei, he's not getting any younger. And nobody really knows what's going to happen when he goes. And also Iran, as we've talked about on this show, they've had quite a few problems with their own population. And so how's this going to play out for them? They're not a democracy, so they don't have to worry about, being ousted at the next election or anything like that. But if I were them, I would be a little bit apprehensive about getting into a full-on major war because I don't think people are going to like that.
Yeah, it's a young country and
yes.
a young, relatively idealistic country that's educated. You could see a significant anti-war faction in the war-fighting age group.
Exactly. Now, of course, they could just crack down on them brutally, which is what they normally do. Right.
Yeah, you're not going to have any 1960s Vietnam style protests in Iran.
Oh, you could have them, but they're just brutally crushed.
Right. Yeah. Whew. It is. I just keep coming back to October 7th. Hamas really kicked over the anthill, and somebody somewhere is still nominally with some power in that organization, and they must be rubbing their hands with evil glee right now.
I don't know about evil glee necessarily, but at some point, and this is, I think, the tragedy of this whole situation between Iran and Israel. And it's like you say, it's very possible that Gaza will fall a few notches down the totem pole. But at some point, people in Israel have to come to some understanding that, for example, the stated goals of the Israeli incursion into Gaza right now are to eradicate or at least cripple Hamas and to gain the release of the hostages. It really doesn't look like they're going to be able to do either of those things. Hamas doesn't even know if they have enough hostages that are left alive, and they very well might not. And maybe they'll be able to get the Hamas leadership, but they haven't been able to do it so far. And so the only thing that Israel's never actually tried to do is make peace. Right? Again, they went into Lebanon, very bad idea, right? It made things worse for them, right? And so these military solutions that they seem to always want to employ just don't ever really work out, or at least not since the Yom Kippur War. That was the last very successful military operation in which the Israelis have engaged. And so if you're 50 years in, after your last success, maybe you're doing something wrong. But, again, it's easy for me to say that here in the United States. But if that kind of understanding can't be achieved, then I don't know what's going to happen. Or I fear I do know, unfortunately, actually.
All right. I think you and I should resolve to leave open the possibility of recording another episode on Saturday as we learn more, because as we mentioned, we are taping this late on Thursday in Los Angeles, although it is Friday in Iran, where this Israeli strike is taking place. Shall we touch on the anniversary of the Sudan Civil War?
Well, sure. I mean, when we talked about this and when it broke out a year ago, it is astonishing to me on certain levels. And all I want to say really is that every bad thing that happened in Israel on October 7th is happening in Sudan right now. Most of the bad things that have happened in Gaza since October 7th are happening in Sudan right now. And both of them, by the way, on a much larger scale. And they're happening every day. I'm happy that there was a donor conference in Paris, I believe on Monday of this week, because it seems as though the international community, in part perhaps because of the strike by Iran last weekend, is beginning to understand that they're going to have to do two things at the same time. They're not going to be able to wait for the war in Gaza to die down before doing something about Sudan, which is an urgent, awful crisis, the worst humanitarian crisis on earth today. And I just want to make sure that people don't forget about that. We do talk about it, here and there, but it's 1 year now. And it hasn't gotten any better at all during that time.
6.5 million internally displaced people, 2 million refugees, and 33,000 casualties in a year of civil war.
Yes. And the only mitigating difference, I would say, is that at least people in Sudan can flee, right? They can have, many of them have crossed borders to try and get away. Now, they're living awful lives in squalid refugee camps, but they have someplace to go, unlike the people in Gaza. That is a big difference, and I want to make sure I make note of that. But it's, again, the rape, the kidnapping, the displacement, everything that we don't like in Gaza is happening in Sudan too. And nobody's talking about it, or at least nowhere near to the same extent.
Okay, that'll do it for this episode of Working for Crusoe. He's Sam Park. I'm John Ramey from Los Angeles. We hope to have a more peaceful weekend, and we'll talk to you next Friday. So long.
So long, everybody.